Hello and welcome. So, who's a narcissist? Is it Keir Starmer or is it Donald Trump? Or both, or neither? Does it matter anyway? Spoiler alert, I think it just might. Let's begin here. NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is a systemic all-pervasive condition, very much like pregnancy. Either you have it or you don't, according to this article. Once you have it day and night. It is an inseparable part of the personality, a recurrent set of behaviour patterns. In other words, it's lifelong. It's the individual. It's them. It's just part of them. It's not going to change. That is one way of thinking about NPD. And what I'm going to say up front is I'm not talking about NPD. I'm not going to talk about that here. I'm talking about narcissism as a trait or series of traits which are inherent in some people's personality, and it's a spectrum. Some people are low, some people are high in those traits. But if you think about traits, I think in many ways this will hopefully make more sense as I go through it. Again, from this same article, Robert Millman, professor of psychiatry, proposes to reverse the accepted chronology, meaning that it's not necessarily something that we're born with and is even lifelong. According to him, pathological narcissism can be induced in adulthood by celebrity, wealth and fame. By pathological narcissism, he means NPD, or closer to NPD, rather than just simply a trait or traits. The victims, inverted commas, billionaire tycoons, movie stars, renowned authors, politicians and other authority figures develop grandiose fantasies, lose their erstwhile ability to empathise, react with rage to slights both real and imagined, and in general act like textbook narcissists. What he's saying is that by getting into certain positions, by having people around them who may be sycophantic, then some people can become essentially the equivalent of an NPD individual, but it has been acquired, although some others suggest that the propensity to develop an NPD-like approach to life is already there, that some people are more likely to develop situational narcissism than others. And I think that's a fair point. Let's then go here to this article, The Why and How of Narcissism, a process model of narcissistic status pursuit. I wanted to actually home in on this particular overview because I think it's really good, and I think it actually points us to two particular ways to consider the narcissist, which I believe are important and useful to all of us actually in day-to-day life. We propose a self-regulation model of grandiose narcissism. This model illustrates an interconnected set of processes through which narcissists, i.e. individuals with relatively high levels of grandiose narcissism, so we're talking grandiose narcissism here. There is more than one other type of narcissism, we'll come on to that later, I promise, pursue social status in their moment-by-moment transactions with their environments. The model shows that narcissists select situations that afford status. That could include a job, or go into that meeting, or be seen with certain people. Narcissists vigilantly attend to cues related to the status they and others have in these situations, and on the basis of these perceived cues, appraise whether they can elevate their status or reduce the status or status of others. Narcissists engage in self-promotion, the admiration pathway, as it's been called here, or other derogation, the rivalry pathway, in accordance with these appraisals. Now, what I think is important to recognize there is that narcissists not only seek to elevate themselves, to find that job, to find that position, to be seen with the right people, but they can also use that derogation pathway, that rivalry pathway, to push other people down. So it's not just a question of pulling themselves up, it's also, where appropriate, pushing others out of the way and perhaps rubbishing them in reputational ways as well. So then, let's go to this little paper here. Different forms of narcissism and leadership. There is an ongoing research interest in narcissism and its relation to leadership, which may be because narcissism is a paradoxical trait with both positive and negative sides. Prevailing research on narcissism and leadership has focused on narcissism as a personality trait in comparison to pathological narcissism, meaning, in my opinion, I think this is what they mean, NPD. So it's not a personality that is there throughout life. It's a trait or traits, which of course can be there for a long period of time, but also potentially may be acquired. And it's grandiose in comparison to vulnerable facet. So they're focused on narcissism as a personality trait as opposed to personality disorder, and it's grandiose facet as opposed to vulnerable. So vulnerable narcissism is one of the different types of narcissism that is around. But most people, I say most people, on average probably, when they think about narcissism, we're talking about grandiose narcissism. And we will come on to vulnerable narcissism in a little while. I want to jump to this little article here. Narcissistic bosses, the right dose makes the difference. What do they mean? Narcissism is a non-clinical personality trait that is stronger in some people and weaker in others. Kind of what I was talking about earlier. There are two types of narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable. There's actually more than two, but if I mention that, I may look a little bit narcissistic, so I won't. Vulnerable narcissism includes strong feelings of insecurity and distrust and is for this reason not often associated with leadership positions. In our study, we focused on grandiose narcissism. And what I want to show here is, I'm going to skip down to, our results showed that there is an inverted U-shaped relationship between supervisors' grandiose narcissism and followers' satisfaction with their boss. So it's not all bad. How can we explain this? If narcissism is too low, supervisors lack the capacity to be self-confident and gain the admiration and trust of their subordinates. An element of self-confidence is required, and an element of charisma, I would argue, is required. The ability to communicate well, to pull people together, to get them heading in the same direction. If narcissism is too high, however, supervisors express too much rivalry in the form of reactive anger. They can talk down to their subordinates, they can criticize them. In both cases, too low and too high narcissism, subordinates are less satisfied with the boss, unsurprisingly. Well, unsurprisingly, if it's high, because they're going to get criticised, because they're seen as rivals. But if it's too low, then the supervisor, the boss, the manager, the leader, just don't look on top of their game, and that can unsettle people. Let's then go back to this article. Vulnerable narcissism and leadership. I promised we'd come back to vulnerable narcissism. Besides grandiose narcissism, vulnerable narcissism might also be related to leadership. While narcissistic grandiosity is linked to extroversion, exhibitionism, or overconfidence, narcissistic vulnerability is related to introversion, defensiveness, and neuroticism. Yet both dimensions share a core of antagonism and self-importance, and that is important to remember. Antagonism and self-importance, the grandiose and the vulnerable. Vulnerable narcissistic leaders might express their antagonism differently than grandiose narcissistic leaders, given that only vulnerable narcissism is linked to covert behaviours. For instance, vulnerable narcissistic leaders might engage in passive and less observable forms of destructive leadership. So passive and less observable, or at least less observable for a little while. Provided that vulnerable narcissists achieve a leadership position, because it's more often than not grandiose narcissists, it might be that they have difficulties in building positive relationships with their followers, as they mistrust others. And trust is an important prerequisite for positive leader-follower relationships, isn't it? When you don't trust someone, when the trust is gone in a leader, whether it be in a business or a politician or wherever, then you aren't really a follower. You're just kind of putting up with them, and you don't like it at all. So isn't that interesting? I think it is, at least. Vulnerable narcissistic leaders might behave in disagreeable ways towards their followers, as vulnerable narcissism includes antagonism, similar to grandiose narcissism, that was mentioned already. In line with this, the narcissistic vulnerability was linked to abusive supervision intentions. Vulnerable narcissistic leaders might express their antagonism differently than grandiose narcissistic leaders, given that only vulnerable narcissism is linked to covert behaviours. For instance, vulnerable narcissistic leaders might engage in passive and less observable forms of destructive leadership. So what does this all mean? Well, in terms of narcissistic traits, I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump exhibits grandiose narcissistic traits. That confidence, that, and you may not like to hear it, but to a lot of people it's true, charisma, that sense of certainty, pulling people together. Now, as we noted from that article, that kind of sweet spot for the narcissist, this could be a good thing up to a point. The challenge is if the narcissist who's the grandiose type goes too far, this could include Donald Trump, without checks and balances, then things can get out of hand. But that compelling nature of the narcissist could also, in part at least, explain the popularity of Donald Trump. The fact that people are rallying around, they have hope, they can see a way forward. And whether you like Trump or not, I think it is fair to say that a lot of what he does is very overt.
And I presented a vision to achieve a brighter future for all of humanity. Today I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
I'm not saying there aren't things behind the scenes, but he's right there with his opinion in your face, and you kind of know where you are. And some people also like that. Let's then look at the vulnerable narcissist, which, in case you haven't guessed already, I think in terms of traits, well, Keir Starmer seems to fit that description more readily. Certainly not grandiose. And again, I'm not talking about NPD, just to be clear. So this lack of trust that he seems to have generated, this fixed mindset, this slightly inflexible way of thinking, this ability to look at others and by using covert means, little put downs here and there, the phrases that he used, you may argue that that's overt, but I think it's quite covert. I don't think he's shouting and screaming. I think he's trying to use certain phrases. He's been caught using them.
What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention, when those politicians sat in government for 14 long years, tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it. Now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying.
And that's also a political thing. Again, to be fair to him, a lot of politicians will do that. But we can see, in my opinion, a sense of entitlement with Keir. And he's not alone. I've talked about that already. He's absolutely not alone. And maybe that's not how he began. Maybe he wanted to get into law and politics to help people who were vulnerable. Maybe that's how it started. But what I can see right now, and I can only go on what I'm observing, just like you, again, trying to figure this all out, he looks like someone who doesn't seem to engage readily, who seems to lack a bit of empathy with certain individuals, and the behaviours, the decisions that have been made, I've said it before as well, I believe lack empathy, quite a lot of them. And so what have we got? We've got someone who on the surface is saying, I'm here to help. We've got someone who isn't like Trump, who have said is very overt. This covert stuff that's going on, I think is what people are picking up on. I think this is what is unsettling people. And that lack of charisma, that lack of hope, that lack of, hey, here's how things are going to be, here's how good it's going to be, has also deeply unsettled people. And once more, I would say to those good people in the Labour Party and who are around Keir, you need to get him to change his game or get him to move somewhere to the side and get someone in who embodies a more empathic leader and someone who cares and who can build trust. This is essential. Without trust, there's no leader. There's no leadership, because there are no followers, or the vast majority of them do not follow and are at the stage where they don't believe almost anything.